When I first hit rock bottom, it felt like the world had slammed its doors shut in my face. I woke up every morning with the same knot in my stomach, wondering how I had let my life spiral into such chaos. The savings I once had were gone, debts loomed over me like storm clouds, and my pride, what little remained, was crumbling under the weight of failure. There was a time when I believed I was destined for success, but now I was a shadow of that person. I remember staring at my reflection one night, my eyes hollow, and asking myself, if I had to start all over again, what would I even do? It was a question that burned through me, one I had no answer for. But life has a strange way of presenting light when you're standing in the darkest corner. A worn-out book, given to me years ago and forgotten on a dusty shelf, practically fell into my lap as I searched for old paperwork. Its title was simple, unassuming, but inside were the teachings of Florence Scovel Shinn. I didn't recognize her name at the time, and I wasn't searching for spiritual wisdom. All I wanted was money, a way out, a chance to breathe again. Yet something inside me urged me to open those pages, and as I began to read, I felt like the words were speaking directly to me. She wrote about a law, an unseen law that governs our lives, one that responds to what we think, speak, and believe. Your word is your wand, she said, and it hit me like a revelation. Up until then, my words were filled with despair. I'm broke. I can't catch a break. Life is unfair. If what she said was true, I wasn't just describing my reality. I was creating it. That realization shook me because it meant I was the architect of my own misery. That night, sitting in my dimly lit room, I decided to try something I had never done before. I repeated one of her affirmations, slowly at first, then with more confidence. I am one with the abundance of the universe. Money flows to me easily and effortlessly. At first it felt absurd, like a lie I was telling myself. I laughed nervously after the first few repetitions, shaking my head. But then I remembered her words. It's not about forcing belief, but about planting a seed. Seeds don't look like trees, and they don't give fruit instantly, yet if you water them daily, something inevitable happens. They grow. So I whispered the affirmation again, softer this time, almost as if I didn't want anyone to hear. I am one with the abundance of the universe. Money flows to me easily and effortlessly. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the weight of hopelessness pressing down so heavily. It was just a flicker, a spark, but it was there. The following morning, I woke up with the usual dread. But before I let my mind wander into worry, I forced myself to repeat the words again. It was awkward. My mind argued back, mocking me. You're broke, you're jobless, and you're chanting nonsense. Yet somewhere deeper, quieter, a part of me whispered, what if she's right? That what if was enough to keep me going. I decided to treat it like an experiment. Every day, I would repeat this practice no matter how I felt. I didn't know if it would work, but it gave me something to hold onto. I wrote the affirmation on sticky notes and placed them on my mirror, my fridge, and even my phone screen. Whenever despair tried to creep back in, I fought it with the words. Slowly, my inner dialogue began to shift. Instead of saying, I can't afford this, I caught myself saying, the money I need comes to me at the right time. Instead of envying others who had what I wanted, I started blessing them in my thoughts. Their wealth proves abundance exists for me too. At first, it felt like pretending, but over time, it became a habit. The world outside didn't transform overnight. My bills didn't vanish, and opportunities didn't rain down from the sky instantly. But something inside me changed, and that made all the difference. I started to notice possibilities I would have ignored before. For example, a neighbor mentioned a temporary gig that I normally would have dismissed as not worth it. But this time, I took it. It wasn't glamorous. but it gave me just enough to cover groceries for the week. And as I walked home with those groceries, I whispered a thank you to the universe, just as Florence had taught. Thank you for the supply that flows to me. One night, I found myself reflecting on this shift. I realized that my circumstances hadn't magically fixed themselves, but my perspective had softened. My fear wasn't choking me as tightly, and I had a sense of control again. Not over the economy or the world, but over myself. That was a victory I hadn't tasted in years. In those early weeks, the practice was less about attracting millions and more about surviving the crushing weight of despair. Yet, looking back, I know now that was the foundation being laid. The daily repetition was chiseling away at years of negative thinking, replacing them with seeds of faith. It didn't matter that I didn't fully believe it yet. What mattered was that I kept saying it over and over until my heart began to catch up with the words. And so, in the quiet of those nights, when loneliness and fear tried to swallow me whole, I would return to the phrase like a lifeline. I am one with the abundance of the universe. Money flows to me easily and effortlessly. Sometimes I repeated it with tears streaming down my face, sometimes with clenched fists, sometimes with a fragile smile. But I repeated it nonetheless. If you had asked me back then why I kept going, I couldn't have given you a logical answer. All I knew was that something inside me refused to let go of that fragile thread of hope. Florence had given me a simple daily practice, and even though everything outside screamed failure, I chose to trust the seed I was planting. That choice, that small act of faith, was the first step on the long road that would eventually lead me back not just to financial stability, but to the kind of wealth I once thought was reserved. For others, it all began with a whisper in the dark, a phrase that seemed like nothing more than empty words until they weren't. Day after day, I clung to the practice as if it were the only rope keeping me from drowning. At first, it felt mechanical. I would repeat the affirmation while brushing my teeth, while making coffee, while walking down the street. Sometimes I didn't even believe what I was saying. The words felt hollow, like echoes bouncing in an empty room. But Florence's teachings lingered in my mind. Repetition carves grooves in the soul, and eventually those grooves become pathways for reality to follow. So I kept at it almost stubbornly. The days were still hard. My debts didn't vanish just because I whispered words of abundance. My fridge was still often empty, and my phone buzzed with reminders of unpaid bills. But something subtle was happening beneath the surface. I was no longer collapsing under the weight of despair. Where before I saw only walls, I began to notice cracks of light. The world didn't change overnight, but I was changing, and that shift began to draw small, unexpected opportunities toward me. One morning, while repeating the affirmation on my walk to a job interview I wasn't sure I'd get, I noticed how differently I carried myself. I wasn't walking like a man begging for a chance. I was walking like someone who already had value to give. I held my head higher, and when I shook the interviewer's hand, there was a calm confidence in my grip that hadn't been there before. They didn't hire me, but instead of walking out crushed as I would have before, I walked out thinking, that door closed because a better one is opening. That single thought was foreign to me, yet it felt powerful. Within a week, I got a call from an old acquaintance I hadn't spoken to in years. He remembered that I once had skills in marketing and asked if I could help him with a small project. Normally, I would have brushed it off as too small to matter, but something inside me urged me to say yes. It wasn't much money, but when I finished the project, he was so pleased that he recommended me to someone else. That someone else led to another job, and before long, I had a string of small freelance projects. It was modest, but it was movement, and movement is what I needed most. During this time, the daily affirmations evolved from mere words into fuel. They began shaping not only how I thought, but how I acted. Instead of seeing myself as a victim of bad luck, I started seeing myself as a magnet for good. When I walked into a room, I reminded myself, abundance is here, waiting for me to recognize it. That mindset made me more open, more receptive, and more willing to say yes to opportunities. And opportunities, I realized, had always been around me. It was my closed, fearful state that had kept me blind to them. I also began to notice how my relationships shifted. In the past, I envied others who had what I didn't. I resented their cars, their homes, their success, but Florence's words kept echoing. Envy blocks your blessings, while gratitude and blessing unlock them. So I began silently blessing the wealth of others. When I saw a luxury car, instead of muttering, "Must be nice," I whispered that abundance flows through the same source I'm connected to. Mine is on the way. When I saw someone celebrate a big win, I congratulated them sincerely, knowing their success was proof that success existed for me too. At first it felt forced, but soon it became natural. The bitterness melted, replaced by a strange sense of joy when others succeeded. And the strangest thing of all, the more I celebrated others, the more reasons I found to celebrate myself. New clients came in. Small checks started adding up. Ideas I had once dismissed began turning into profitable ventures. One afternoon, while sitting at a cafe, working on one of these new projects, I caught myself smiling for no reason. I realized that I was no longer obsessed with lack. Instead of counting what I didn't have, I was counting what I did. And gratitude, as Florence had promised, became a magnet for more. The universe seemed to respond to my energy, delivering small but steady streams of income and connections. But it wasn't just about money. The daily habit was rewiring my entire being. My mornings no longer started with dread, but with quiet determination. I began journaling, writing down affirmations, and visualizing the life I wanted. A comfortable home, financial freedom, the ability to help others. At night, I would replay the day in my mind, but instead of focusing on failures, I highlighted every small victory. A paid bill, a new contact, a smile from a stranger, each was evidence that I was walking in alignment with abundance. And slowly, people began to notice. Friends commented that I looked lighter, more confident. A neighbor once said, "You've got this glow about you, like something good is always happening." I laughed, but deep inside, I knew it wasn't luck. It was the secret Florence had revealed. The daily practice had built a foundation so solid that even when challenges came, I no longer crumbled. One of the most pivotal moments came when I was offered a chance to partner in a small startup. The old me would have declined out of fear, worried about failing again. But the new me, armed with the daily rhythm of abundance, said yes. That yes changed everything. It wasn't easy, but with each obstacle, I leaned on the affirmations. I am one with the abundance of the universe. Money flows to me easily and effortlessly. That phrase carried me through negotiations, setbacks, and late nights. It reminded me that lack was an illusion and supply was always waiting to meet my need. Months turned into a year, and I could see clearly how far I had come. From empty cupboards and sleepless nights to steady income and growing confidence. I wasn't a millionaire yet, but I was no longer the broken person who thought wealth was out of reach. I was building not just a business, but a life, brick by brick, belief by belief. And I knew without question that if I stayed faithful to the practice, the millions would come not as some magical windfall, but as the natural harvest of the seeds I was planting every single day. Looking back, I realized the biggest shift wasn't external, it was internal. The money, the opportunities, the relationships were all reflections of the inner transformation. Florence Scovel Shinn was right. The game of life is won not by force, but by alignment, and the daily affirmations were the key that unlocked the door. I often think about that time now, and I know with certainty that if I had to start over again, I wouldn't panic. I wouldn't fear. I'd simply go back to the practice, repeating it with faith, planting seeds every day until the harvest came. Because now I know, it always does. Months blended into years, and as I remained faithful to the daily practice, my life slowly began to reflect a new story. The man who once struggled to put food on the table was now standing in rooms where opportunities flowed as naturally as conversation. My business, which had started as a string of odd jobs and small freelance projects, was now becoming something stable, even profitable. Yet what struck me most wasn't the money itself. It was the way I thought, the way I carried myself, the way I believed. The affirmations were no longer forced. They weren't words I had to remind myself to say. They had become the rhythm of my mind, woven into my thoughts the way breath is woven into life. When challenges came, and they still did, my response wasn't panic anymore. I would stop, breathe, and remind myself, I am one with the abundance of the universe. Money flows to me easily and effortlessly. Those words calmed storms inside me that once would have destroyed me. They reminded me that setbacks were detours, not dead ends. There was a turning point when I realized just how much the practice had reshaped me. I was invited to a conference filled with entrepreneurs, investors, and creators. A few years earlier, I would have walked into such a place feeling small, unworthy, like an imposter among giants. But this time, I walked in knowing I belonged, not because I had made millions yet, but because I had learned the real secret. Wealth isn't about a number, it's about identity. I was already rich in mindset, rich in vision, rich in faith. The rest would follow. At that event, I met people who would later become partners, mentors, and collaborators. And it wasn't because I pitched myself perfectly or had the best resume. It was because of the energy I carried. Confidence is magnetic, faith is contagious, and people can sense when you believe in yourself. That belief drew them to me, and doors began opening one after another. I remember one late night, sitting in my apartment, reviewing my bank statements. For the first time in years, I wasn't drowning. Not only were my debts paid off, but my savings account was growing. My investments were working for me. I could buy things without anxiety clawing at my chest. I could give without fear that generosity would leave me empty. And as I sat there, gratitude overwhelmed me. I whispered a quiet thank you, not just to the universe, but to the version of myself who, in the darkest days, chose to keep repeating words that seemed impossible. That version of me planted the seeds I was now harvesting. What amazed me most was how natural it felt. There was no sudden lottery win, no miracle check falling from the sky. Instead, there was a steady, faithful unfolding. Opportunities showed up, I acted on them, and results compounded over time. It was as if the universe had been waiting for me to align with it before releasing what had always been mine. Florence had said, the invisible forces of supply and demand are always at work, and now I understood what she meant. I reached a point where I could finally call myself financially free. The phrase millionaire no longer felt like a dream. It was within reach, and I knew it was only a matter of time. But here's the part that surprised me most. The number didn't matter as much as I thought it would. What mattered was knowing that if I lost it all tomorrow, I could build it again. The practice had given me a blueprint that was indestructible. Money might come and go, but the ability to attract it, to create it, to align with it. That was mine forever. One morning, as I sipped coffee in my own home office, a place that once felt like a fantasy, I wrote in my journal, if I had to start over tomorrow, I wouldn't be afraid. I would simply go back to the practice. I would speak abundance, live gratitude, and align with faith until the millions came again. That realization filled me with a peace I had never known before. It meant freedom, not just financial, but emotional and spiritual freedom. I began teaching others what I had learned, not because I saw myself as a guru, but because I wanted people to know that wealth wasn't reserved for the lucky or the few. I shared Florence's teachings, told my story, and encouraged others to try the daily practice. Some scoffed, some ignored me, but others listened. And when they returned with their own testimonies, when they told me how repeating those affirmations shifted their lives, I knew the secret was bigger than me. It was a gift meant to be passed on. There were still days when doubt tried to creep in, when challenges tested my resolve. A deal would fall through, an investment wouldn't perform, or unexpected expenses would show up. But unlike the man I used to be, I no longer spiraled into fear. I reminded myself that abundance wasn't tied to one client, one project, or one account. It flowed endlessly, and as long as I aligned with it, more would come. That unshakable trust was worth more than any dollar amount in my bank. Years later, when I finally crossed the line into millionaire status, I celebrated not with extravagance, but with gratitude. I knew it wasn't the money that made me rich. It was the journey. It was the nights of whispering affirmations through tears, the mornings of forcing myself to believe when evidence screamed otherwise, the countless small choices to act in faith instead of fear. That was the true wealth, the wealth no one could take from me. Now, when people ask me the secret, I smile. They expect me to hand them a business model, an investment strategy, or a step-by-step financial plan. And while those things have their place, I always tell them the truth. It started with words. It started with a daily practice that seemed laughably simple. It started with faith that abundance was mine even when I couldn't see it. That was the foundation, and everything else grew from there. So if I had to start over tomorrow, if I lost every dollar, every connection, every business, I wouldn't despair. I would know exactly what to do. I'd return to the daily practice, plant the seeds of abundance with my words, water them with gratitude, and watch them grow again. Because I now understand, the millionaire mind set isn't about what you have, but about what you believe. And once you believe, what you have will always catch up.